This is Professor Miller, and I am back with another lecture video. This is my third lecture video for Transcendentalism, our advanced course in literature. And this one is on the subject of Ralph Waldo Emerson and his great lecture, the Divinity School Address. So as you know, to get started, Transcendentalism began as a kind of countercultural religious movement among Unitarians in the new United States. Now, the groundwork was already paved in the United States for a movement like Transcendentalism because the country had already been founded on the idea of religious freedom. So many of the people coming to the United States were coming here even before it became the United States, when it was a British colony, because they were seeking something new. They were seeking a way, a freer way to worship, something that didn't seem so beholden to the past, something that was a fresh break with either the Catholic Church or one of the Protestant denominations in Europe at the time, which to many people seemed to have grown corrupt. The Church's ties with politics in Europe had led to all kinds of corrupt transactions. In the Catholic Church, for example, you could supposedly purchase forgiveness in heaven so that your soul would be clear. And these kinds of things appalled many Christians, and those that felt this way about their faith often came to the United States because of the promise of religious freedom and the ability to build any kind of a church you wanted. And the Unitarian Church was one of those kind of splinter churches already. It was already, before Emerson, before all these people we've been studying, it was already a kind of free-thinking branch of Christianity. Not quite as free-thinking as Emerson asked it to be, however. Last class, we studied three historical figures who were important to the foundation of the religious foundation of Transcendentalism. We studied William Ellery Channing and his essay Humanity's Likeness to God, which was from 1828, the earliest of the essays we've looked at. And I talked about how Channing was an influence on Emerson and others. He was an influential figure. Many of the Transcendentalists who we're studying began as Channing Unitarians, meaning they were followers of Channing within the church. And Channing was considered a great theologian, a great interpreter of his religion's sacred word. We talked about Orestes Brownson, who was rare among the Transcendentalists in that he came from a poor family, which gave him a more, how to put it exactly, activist, I guess you could say, attitude toward the relationship between religion and society. Because he came from an underprivileged background, he felt more motivated to help the poor, and he turned this desire to help the poor and the underprivileged into a kind of activist mode of Transcendentalism, which influenced many others. He didn't publish as much writing as someone like Emerson, so he's not studied as much today in English departments. However, Orestes Brownson is an interesting historical figure and worth knowing. And we also studied George Ripley. He wrote a letter called The Letter of Intent to Resign, which was the beginning of a slow process by which Ripley eventually left the Transcendentalist Church, following in Emerson's footsteps. And Ripley was a scholar like Emerson, but toward the end of his career as a Transcendentalist Christian, before he fully left the church, he became more activist, and he began to think about ways to bring his concept of a newer, freer form of faith and living to a countercultural splinter commune known as Brook Farm, which we'll be studying shortly. And those were the three original Transcendentalist Christians who were sort of either before or around Emerson, forming the context for Emerson's great essays. He knew all of them. They all knew each other. They talked and debated ideas. And I also had you read a short piece by Emerson for last class called A Young Minister Refuses to Perform a Crucial Duty, which was from 1832, 4 years after Channing's early essay. Early for Emerson. This was a statement originally written to the church about how he refused to deliver communion and thus was no longer suitable to be a minister. Communion is a very important religious rite among Christians. It was then, it still is among most denominations. holding that it involves food and drink. And in his letter, Emerson protests against this by saying that using food and drink to symbolize, important aspects of faith. I don't get into it too much. Emerson compared that to Eastern religions, and that was a savvy move. His point there was to portray the things that he found dislikable within Christianity as foreign. That was a rhetorical move on his part. If he could get his fellow Christians to see communion as having come about due to a foreign influence, then he thought he might be able to resist giving it and convince some others that maybe it's not as important as it should be, not as important as they thought it should be. One of the important quotes from this letter from 1832 by Emerson was, "Freedom is the essence of Christianity." It's a pretty bold statement. His point is that Christianity has as its goal simply to make men good and wise, as Emerson put it. Emerson wrote that Christianity's institutions should be as flexible as humanity's needs. And he thought that the forms out of which life and suitableness have departed should be as worthless in men's eyes as dead leaves falling around us. So once the life has left the ritual should be abandoned. And lifeless rituals are compared by Emerson to dead leaves in the autumn sky. Beautiful in how they fall, but livable no more. And communion, this practice of believing you can ingest the spiritual value of Christ through food and drink that's been blessed by a priest or a preacher, is an ancient form, and he traces its historical origins back to Eastern religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on. And I'm not sure about the technical details of how valid that is, but it is true that those religions had similar rituals to that. So his point was that this isn't really core to what it means to be a person of faith, and it's not core to his idea of a ministry. Well, that was radical enough for him to no longer be a Unitarian minister. But in 1838, he did something even more radical, something more groundbreaking, something that has come to be even more famous. That is his Divinity School Address, which was delivered in 1838 to the Harvard Divinity School. Before I talk about what this address means, I want to stop to make sure you understand exactly what a Divinity School Address means. So this wasn't something he wrote out and published. This was a speech that he gave as a valedictorian speech to graduating, more or less, seniors at Harvard School for outgoing ministers. So this wasn't unlike, a speech being given to the young men studying Torah uptown on the way to become Judaism's future rabbis. These were the future ministers of Christianity he was speaking to. And he was speaking from within what you might call the inner sanctum of transcendentalist faith. It wasn't just students he spoke to, but all of the higher-ups of transcendentalism were present. All of the grandees and formal authorities of his faith were there listening to this, and he knew that. And he wrote this radical essay, which challenges so many of the most important articles of Christian faith right before their very eyes. He did this as a way of making a point, of establishing himself, not unlike today how people will do radical and controversial acts to get attention. Well, Emerson wanted to call attention to his ideas, and he didn't do it through something profane or superficial. He did it through something deep. But it is an effort at using a sensational speech to get eyeballs onto his words and ideas. It is, in fact, the fieriest and most controversial of Emerson's speeches. How fiery? Well, after he delivered this speech, he wasn't invited to give another talk at Harvard for almost 30 years. The students who he spoke to mostly loved it, but their teachers and his fellow ministers thought it was over the top, just too far. And they, more or less branded him a radical and told him he was no longer welcome in their institution. It seems like Emerson knew that would happen, and he probably was planning for it to happen as a part of why he delivered such a radical speech at such a sensitive location. This huge fallout from the speech resulted in lots of people taking sides. And I asked you to read one of the articles of that fallout from a man named Norton, who was kind of the leader of the various more conservative the more conservative Unitarians who were against Emerson and the Transcendentalists. Andrew Norton responded and attacked Emerson, calling his reasoning faulty, his taste bad, and his manners horrible. So yeah, they really didn't like what Emerson had to say. Nevertheless, it's become a classic of American literature, one of the, supposedly, one of the finest examples of Christian oratory. It's one of the great speeches of the Christian faith, and it's even though it's a radical speech, it's still considered in many ways a Christian speech. There's an old saying I heard, I'm not sure where I heard this before, but the saying goes, God most loves his greatest rebels. That's kind of stuck with me. Emerson is one of those great rebels. So for the remaining time during this talk, I'm going to go over what he had to say in his Divinity School Address and why I think it's worth you learning and what's important about it. Well, one of his themes is one that he's already established a little bit in some of the other writings that we've studied by Emerson, including Nature, and that is his theme of good and evil. According to Emerson, because the divine is intrinsically perfect, goodness is real, while evil, the absence of goodness, is not an absolute quality, I should say, in and of itself. Goodness is identified with life, evil with death. In straying from goodness, humanity progressively loses its connection with the divine, is diminished, and, from a universal point of view, if not physically, ceases to exist. According to Emerson, to be good is to be, and to be evil is not to be at all. There's also a kind of deep, integrative religious theme. The word for that is ecumenical. I think I've mentioned it to you before in this class. It's a word I want you to know. It could come up on a quiz. Ecumenical is a form of belief common to many religions, a representative form that's either universal or nearly so. So things which many different forms of faith accept as true are said to be ecumenical. And according to Emerson, there are many ecumenical aspects to Christianity which it derives from Eastern sources. This was not an acceptable attitude for the other higher-ups of Unitarianism at the Harvard Divinity School. For them, Christianity was the one true faith. So arguing that Christianity is just like all these other faiths was sort of a slap in the face, in a way, to their belief system. Even more of a slap in the face, though, was the role that Emerson proposed for Christ's miracles, events that Christ is said to have performed during his lifetime, which form the core stories of the New Testament. Emerson argues that the church has offered false miracles in place of the true miracles of everyday existence. It's not so much that Emerson's saying that Christ never did these things. What he's saying is that they no longer exist before our eyes. They're just stories. For Emerson, we should be discovering miracles, not just remembering them. Emerson hates how religious life has become wholly centered on repeating the past. And he refers to this replacement of everyday miracles in the world all around us with formal worship of previous ideas and things that had happened in ancient times. He calls that formalism. And formalism is his enemy in the Divinity School Address. He goes after formalism as a dead way of worshiping. At the end of the essay, he compares this deadened, formal, historical, memory-based way of worshiping to leaves falling from the trees. And like the leaves from the autumn trees, they may be beautiful, but they're no longer alive. They're no longer providing vitality to the body. It's what Emerson doesn't say about Christ that outraged many of his fellow Unitarians. He never says that Christ was the one true Son of God. That's what the upper-ups at the Harvard Divinity School wanted to hear. That was the orthodoxy that he spurned. And we catch that in his new interpretation of Christ on page 134 from our class book. The Divinity School Address, by the way, if you're following along, begins on page 129. And on 134, he says this about Christ. Jesus Christ belonged to the true race of prophets. So there he's putting Christ on the same level with the Hebrew prophets of the Ancient Testament. That was not acceptable to his Christian peers. He goes on. He saw with open eye the mystery of the soul, drawn by its severe harmony, ravished with its beauty. He lived in it and had his being there. Alone in all history, Christ estimated the greatness of man. One man was true to what is in you and me. He saw that God incarnates himself in man and evermore goes forth to take possession of his world. He said, in this jubilee of sublime emotion, I am divine. Through me, God acts. Through me, speaks. So, what he's saying here is that Christ was the perfection of humanity. He doesn't deny that he was the Son of God, but he doesn't attribute to that role the special status that others believed him to have. And he refers to this this kind of humanist interpretation of Christ as the greatest elevation possible for Christ. So he challenges the idea that Christ as miracle worker is more important or authoritative than Christ as sort of supreme humanist. He also interprets Christ in a way that subverts his rituals of veneration, meaning, for one, communion, like we already discussed, which is one of the rituals that he subverts. But for Emerson, since Christ is he who awakens man to his own worth, to truly worship Christ is to worship the divine within each one of us, not to worship what Emerson thinks of as empty formal rituals, bowing down at the feet of Christ or praising Christ, an image of Christ, all that. He really wants us to look inward and imitate what he believes were Christ's actions, not to idolatrize his iconic image, so to speak. So one of the famous parts is on page 136, where he says, the top in paragraph 2 on page 136, that is always best which gives me to myself. The sublime is excited in me by the great stoical doctrine, obey thyself. That which shows God in me fortifies me. That which shows God out of me makes me a wart and a wen. Again, find the divine within. Only valid religion is that which defines divinity as a kind of radiant inward principle. To locate divinity in ritual is a kind of death in life for Emerson. Some really great short quotes here. On page 141, he says, wherever a man comes, there comes revolution. Sounds like some quote you would see on a meme on the internet. In fact, a lot of these sentences lifted out of this essay have become like famous quotes. It used to be you would see them on inspirational calendars. You know, those calendars that would have like a picture of something, like a nature scene, and then a quote. Emerson was super popular. His words were super popular on those. More often today, you'll see him in memes by well-intentioned New Agers, environmentalist people like that, and also more conservative Christians who aren't aware of just how radical Emerson was. But his words get recycled over and over again on the internet. If you take like any one or two sentences from this and run it through Google, I bet you'll find that it's been used in ways that might surprise you. Another one of those famous short quotes from the essay is, The imitator dooms himself to hopeless mediocrity. That's from page 142. The imitator dooms himself to hopeless mediocrity. Again, praising originality, trying to inspire creativity, and believing that to be Christ-like, to be divine, is to be a kind of holy artist of the divine, a creator from within of blessings. He says man is the wonder worker, kind of backing up that thought. And that imitation cannot go above its model. He says, by trusting your own heart, you will gain more confidence in other men. So the path toward harmony and love is self-reliance, according to Emerson. And then on page 144, we have this marvelous quote from the second paragraph, about 2/3 of the way down. Faith makes us and not we it, and faith makes its own forms. So what he's saying here is that if faith is alive and burning within you, you will discover spontaneously the correct forms of worship. You will be inspired to do it the way a flame burns in the air. And the movement of the flame is itself the right form. Instead of trying to follow along with how a bunch of other people have decided to repeat an action as a way of defining faith or, making a public statement about faith, Emerson believes that faith will correctly find its own forms if it's followed truly. Almost done. Just a few other points I want to make about this. So after this sort of devastating and fiery invective where he says so many controversial things, he states that there are ministers who do in fact bring life to public worship. He does like ministers in the institution of preaching. He says, though, that there are exceptions, and the exceptions are found not so much in examples of a few ordinary preachers as in the rare, sincere moments of all. He thinks all preachers have moments of rare sincerity. That inclusion of the word rare must have angered them. But by and large, he thinks that preaching is hindered by tradition, by a lack of understanding of what he thinks is the true essence of religion, the soul. And he thinks that the Christian faith must rediscover itself. It must break with the past, do away with the old empty forms, and find new forms. This was a call to arms among Christianity's most devout young people, the future leaders of the faith, to go out and try something new and different, and to find that thing for themselves. He doesn't give them all the answers. This is more of a provocation for them to look within and to discover their own answers. However, he does finish his address with some praise for Christianity. He wants to offer a caveat or a kind of conciliatory point at the end, and he says that despite its flaws, Christianity still leaves humanity with what Emerson calls two inestimable advantages. This is from the bottom of page 144 and the top of page 145. Two inestimable advantages Christianity has given to us. First, the Sabbath, the jubilee of the whole world, whose light dawns welcome alike into the closet of the philosopher, into the garret of toil, and into the prison cells, and everywhere suggests, even to the vile, a thought of the dignity of spiritual being. Let it stand forevermore, a temple which new love, new faith, new sight shall restore to more than its first splendor of mankind. So he praises the Sabbath, the day off from work, the day of rest, spent in study and reflection of God's grandeur. And the second institution that he praises and thinks should be conserved and cherished within Christianity is the institution of preaching. The speech, as he says, the speech of man to men, essentially the most flexible of all organs, of all forms. He praises oratory for its flexibility, its improvisational spirit, the way that the orator always has to look within for words rather than just reciting them from a book. So he loves the institution of preaching, he loves the Sabbath, and he sees these two facts as foundational pillars to retain and build a new faith upon. And that's what this essay is. That's what this speech, written out now as an essay, was and remains a kind of passionate call to arms for devout young seekers to try their own way and to trust themselves and to look within for God's Spirit. I'm not sure how these ideas seem to you, whether radical or not. I never really know exactly how my students are going to respond to these things. But you can be sure that when this speech was given at Harvard, it really stirred the hornet's nest. I've already mentioned Norton, and we'll talk about that in class and the controversy more. That's it. That's my lecture for today. I hope that this helps you to better understand the Harvard Divinity School Address. I'll leave it at that and see you all in class on Monday. Take care, be well, and